Have you ever noticed how dangerous a small mistake can become once people begin questioning your mind? Because sometimes all it takes is one forgotten appointment, one repeated story, one misplaced item. And suddenly the people around you stop seeing you as capable and start seeing you as someone who needs supervision instead. And that's exactly how it started for me, not with some dramatic event, not with a diagnosis, not with anything serious at all, but with tiny, ordinary moments that slowly turned into something much bigger inside my own family. Have you ever felt people looking at you differently before they admitted it out loud? Because that feeling changes the atmosphere around you immediately. The first time I noticed it clearly was after I forgot where I left my reading glasses. That was it, something every human being on earth has done 1,000 times. I eventually found them sitting beside the kitchen sink exactly where I had left them earlier that morning. But when my daughter saw me searching for them, something in her expression changed. Concern, not normal concern, careful concern, the kind people use when they're quietly evaluating you. Have you ever noticed how quickly people can turn ordinary aging into something frightening? Because that's exactly what began happening after that. Suddenly, every little mistake carried extra weight. If I forgot a word during conversation, someone noticed. If I repeated a story, someone exchanged glances across the room. If I became tired, they called it confusion instead of exhaustion. Have you ever realized people can slowly build a completely different version of you out of normal human moments? Because that realization changes the way you experience your own life. At first, I tried laughing it off. That seemed easiest. Families worry, people overreact sometimes. Maybe I was imagining things, but slowly the pattern became impossible to ignore. Conversations changed around me. My children began speaking more slowly when explaining things. They repeated simple information unnecessarily. Sometimes they even answered questions I never asked. Have you ever noticed how people subtly change their tone once they stop fully trusting your mind? Because that change hurts more than they realize. One evening during dinner, I forgot the name of a restaurant we used to visit years ago. Just one small mental pause, a normal moment. But suddenly, the entire table became strangely quiet afterward. My son quickly changed the subject, while my daughter gave him a look I wasn't supposed to notice. Have you ever seen people communicate silently about you while sitting right in front of you? Because that kind of moment stays with you long afterward. And after that dinner, something shifted completely. The family no longer treated my memory lapses like harmless aging. They started treating them like evidence, evidence of decline. Have you ever realized people can slowly create a narrative about you before you even know it's happening? Because that realization changes trust permanently, I began noticing little conversations stop whenever I entered rooms. Phone calls became quieter when I walked nearby. Sometimes I'd hear my name spoken softly before silence suddenly followed. At first, I told myself I was overthinking everything, but deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. Have you ever felt excluded from conversations that were clearly about you? Because that feeling creates loneliness inside your own family. Then came the doctor appointments. That's when the situation started feeling heavier. My daughter suddenly became very interested in attending appointments with me just to help. Again, maybe another mother would have found comfort in that, but something about it felt different, observational. Like she wasn't there to support me, she was there to evaluate me. Have you ever felt studied by the people closest to you? Because that feeling changes every interaction afterward. During one appointment, the doctor asked me a routine question about medications, and before I could even answer, my daughter interrupted to clarify details I already knew perfectly well myself. It was subtle, polite, but humiliating. Have you ever had someone speak for you while you were still fully capable of speaking for yourself? Because that kind of humiliation settles deeply. And the worst part was this: everyone around me acted like this behavior was completely reasonable. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked whether it made me uncomfortable. It was all framed as help. That word again, help. Have you ever realized control almost always arrives disguised as concern first? Because that understanding changes how you hear certain words forever. Slowly, I started feeling like I needed to prove myself constantly. Remember appointments, double check conversations, repeat information carefully so nobody would interpret normal mistakes as confusion. And once you begin living that way, anxiety creates even more mistakes. Have you ever noticed how fear of forgetting something can actually make you forget more? Because that pressure became exhausting. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and overheard something that stopped me cold. My son was speaking quietly to my daughter, and I heard him say, "We need to start preparing in case things get worse." Worse. Have you ever heard people discussing your future like you're already disappearing mentally? Because that sentence changed something inside me immediately. They stopped talking the second they noticed me standing there. Smiles appeared too quickly afterward. Casual conversation returned too fast. And people only react that way when they know you weren't supposed to hear the real discussion. Have you ever entered a room and instantly understood everyone had been talking about you? Because that silence reveals more than words ever could. I smiled calmly and pretended not to think much about it. But later that night, sitting alone in my bedroom, I replayed every strange moment from the past few months differently now. The glances, the whispers, the interruptions, the careful tone people used around me. And slowly, painfully, I realized something terrifying. My family wasn't simply worried about me anymore. They were beginning to believe I was confused. And once people start believing that, they stop listening to you the same way ever again. But the next conversation I overheard made me realize they weren't just worried about my memory anymore. They were already discussing what to do with my life next. Have you ever realized the most painful thing about being treated like you're confused is that people stop hiding the truth around you, because once someone believes your mind is slipping, they become careless with their words, their whispers, their plans, and that's exactly what started happening inside my family after those small memory mistakes became part of a much bigger story they were quietly building about me. Have you ever felt people slowly rewriting who you are while you're still standing right in front of them? Because that's exactly what this became. After overhearing my son say they needed to prepare in case things got worse, I stopped dismissing my instincts. That part mattered. Until then, I kept trying to convince myself I was imagining things, overreacting, becoming too sensitive. But deep down, I already knew something had changed inside this family. Have you ever noticed how your intuition usually understands the truth before your heart wants to accept it? Because that realization changes everything. From that point forward, I started paying closer attention, not emotionally. Quietly, carefully, and the more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms too often to be coincidence now. Family members exchanged subtle looks during ordinary discussions. Sometimes I'd answer a question only to notice someone checking my response, almost like they were testing me. Have you ever felt evaluated by the people who are supposed to trust you? Because that feeling creates loneliness impossible to explain properly. One afternoon, I walked into the dining room unexpectedly and immediately heard silence fall over the conversation. My daughter quickly smiled and asked if I needed tea. Too quickly, too politely. Have you ever noticed how fake calmness appears when people get caught discussing something they wanted hidden? Because that silence told me more than any explanation could. I pretended not to notice and continued walking, but as I moved down the hallway, I heard my name whispered again after they thought I was gone. That was the moment something shifted completely inside me. They weren't just worrying privately anymore. They were discussing me regularly, strategically. Have you ever realized people can slowly turn your life into a family problem to solve? Because that realization changes how safe your own home feels. And perhaps the hardest part was this: they genuinely believed I couldn't fully see what was happening. That's what hurt most. They thought the confusion they imagined in me made them invisible somehow. Have you ever noticed how people become careless once they underestimate your awareness? Because underestimation reveals truth faster than honesty ever could. Then came the conversation that truly changed everything. I woke up late one evening after falling asleep in the living room chair and heard voices drifting quietly from the kitchen. My son and daughter were talking softly, unaware I was awake nearby. At first, I ignored it. Families talk, that's normal. But then I heard my son say something that froze me completely. If things keep getting worse, we may need to start taking over more decisions. Taking over more decisions. Have you ever heard someone discuss your future like your independence already belongs to them? Because that sentence changed everything for me. I stayed completely still listening after that. My daughter sounded hesitant at first, but not disagreeing, more worried about timing. "We have to be careful how we handle it," she said quietly. "Handle it, not help me, handle me." Have you ever realized the language people use around you changes once they stop seeing you as fully capable? Because words reveal intention faster than actions sometimes. Then the conversation turned toward finances, bills, paperwork, making things easier, protecting mom. The same phrases repeated again and again, but underneath every word I heard something deeper growing quietly: control. Have you ever noticed how control always sounds reasonable at the beginning? Because that's what makes it dangerous. I sat there silently listening while my own children discussed my future as though I wasn't fully part of it anymore. And suddenly, every strange moment from the past few months connected together perfectly. The interrupted conversations, the careful tones, the constant monitoring. They weren't simply concerned about my memory. They were building a case emotionally, a quiet family narrative where I slowly became someone incapable of fully managing my own life. Have you ever realized people can slowly create a version of you that benefits their decisions? Because that realization changes trust forever. But strangely enough, instead of panicking after hearing all this, I became calm, very calm, because uncertainty disappeared in that moment. And clarity, even painful clarity, gives you power people don't expect. Have you ever noticed how dangerous understanding becomes once denial finally disappears? Because that understanding changed me completely. I stopped reacting emotionally after that night. That part mattered, because once people think you're confused, emotional reactions only strengthen their belief further. So instead, I became observant, quiet, careful. And because of that, they became even more careless around me. Have you ever let people underestimate you simply so they would reveal more? Because that became my greatest advantage. Over the following days, I noticed even more conversations happening around me instead of with me, decisions discussed before I was informed, concerns shared between family members before anyone spoke to me directly. And every moment confirmed the same painful truth: they no longer fully trusted my mind. Have you ever realized people stopped seeing your words as reliable before they ever admitted it openly? Because that kind of betrayal feels invisible yet crushing at the same time. But while my family quietly discussed what they believed was my growing confusion, they made one huge mistake. They forgot something very important. I was still listening carefully, still understanding everything. And while they thought I wasn't paying attention anymore, I had already started noticing things they never expected me to see. Because the more I listened to their whispered conversations, the more I realized this wasn't just about concern anymore. They were slowly preparing to take control of my entire life. What if people started benefiting from the idea that you weren't fully capable anymore? Because once someone is seen as confused, something dangerous happens: questions stop mattering. Objections become emotional reactions instead of valid concerns, and suddenly other people begin stepping into control of your life while calling it responsibility. And that's exactly what I started realizing after overhearing those conversations in the kitchen. This was no longer just family worry, it was becoming something else entirely. Have you ever noticed how quickly concern can turn into authority once people stop trusting your judgment? Because that realization changes every interaction afterward. After that night, I began paying attention differently, not like a frightened mother trying to hold the family together, like someone quietly gathering truths. And the more truth I gathered, the more disturbing everything became. Have you ever realized people reveal their real intentions through patterns instead of single moments, because the pattern was impossible to ignore now? Suddenly, every decision involving me carried unnecessary supervision. My son insisted on helping with bills I had managed perfectly well for years. My daughter started asking detailed questions about appointments, medications, even daily routines. And every conversation carried the same hidden assumption underneath it all: that eventually I would no longer be capable of handling these things myself. Have you ever realized people slowly start treating your independence like a temporary condition? Because that realization changes how safe your own life feels. At first, I tried responding calmly, rationally. I explained things clearly, repeated details carefully, but something strange began happening. The more capable I sounded, the more carefully they watched me afterward, almost like they were waiting for mistakes to return. Have you ever felt like people wanted proof you were struggling, even when you weren't? Because that feeling creates a very specific kind of fear. Then came the financial conversations more directly. That's when the situation started feeling dangerous instead of simply painful. One afternoon, my son casually mentioned how important it was for the family to prepare early before confusion becomes serious. Serious. Such a heavy word attached to ordinary forgetfulness. Have you ever noticed how people slowly exaggerate your vulnerabilities until they sound permanent? Because exaggeration changes perception faster than truth does. He started discussing things like account access, paperwork organization, future planning, always framed as protection, always calm, always reasonable on the surface. But underneath every conversation sat one terrifying possibility. They were slowly positioning themselves to take control of decisions I still fully understood how to make myself. Have you ever realized people can quietly move toward authority over your life while convincing themselves it's necessary? Because that realization changes trust permanently. What hurt most was how naturally they spoke about it now. There was no hesitation anymore, no discomfort. My family had emotionally adjusted to the idea that I was declining, and once people accept that narrative, they stop seeing your objections as fully reliable. Have you ever noticed how dangerous labels become once enough people believe them? Because that label confused was slowly changing the entire balance inside my family. I started testing something quietly after that, small things. I would intentionally remember details from conversations weeks earlier, mention dates, names, information perfectly clearly, and every time I did, I noticed the same reaction, brief surprise quickly hidden behind polite smiles. Have you ever seen people become uncomfortable when you don't match the version of you they already created in their minds? Because that discomfort revealed more than words ever could. One evening during dinner, my daughter corrected me about a story I was telling, saying gently, "Mom, I think you're mixing things up again." Again, except this time I wasn't wrong. I remembered the details perfectly. And when I calmly pointed that out, silence fell across the table immediately. Have you ever realized people sometimes assume confusion first, before checking whether they're actually mistaken? Because assumptions become dangerous once they replace respect. That moment changed something important for me. Until then, part of me still believed my family was simply overreacting out of fear. But now I started realizing something much deeper. They had become emotionally invested in the idea that I was confused, because that belief justified everything else: the supervision, the financial involvement, the private conversations. The control. Have you ever realized people sometimes need you to appear weak because it supports the role they already stepped into? Because that realization is terrifying once it fully settles in. But strangely enough, once I understood that truth clearly, I stopped feeling helpless completely, because clarity changes posture. Have you ever noticed how powerful understanding becomes once you finally stop doubting yourself? Because that's exactly what happened to me. I stopped trying to convince them I was fine emotionally. Instead, I quietly began paying attention to practical things: paperwork, conversations, decisions happening around me. And little by little, I started collecting something much more important than arguments: evidence. Have you ever realized truth becomes stronger when you stop reacting emotionally and start observing carefully instead? Because observation became my greatest weapon. Meanwhile, my family grew more comfortable every day, more confident, more certain I wasn't fully aware of what was happening around me, and confidence made them careless. Have you ever watched people reveal too much simply because they underestimated you completely? Because that underestimation became my advantage. One afternoon, I overheard my son quietly say something that confirmed every fear I had been trying not to fully believe. "It'll be easier once we officially start handling everything." Officially. Have you ever heard someone discuss taking over your life like it was only a matter of time? Because that sentence changed everything for me. Sitting alone later that evening, replaying those words in my mind, I realized something deeply important. My family no longer saw me as someone who needed occasional help. They were preparing for authority, real authority. And while they thought I was too confused to notice, I had already started gathering the truth they never expected me to uncover. Because while my family quietly prepared to take control of my life, I had already begun uncovering something they desperately wanted hidden. What if the person everyone believed was confused was actually the only one paying attention clearly? Because there's something dangerous about underestimating someone. You stop hiding things carefully, you stop questioning your own behavior. And eventually you begin exposing truths you never intended anyone to see. And that's exactly what started happening inside my family. Once they convinced themselves I no longer fully understood what was going on around me. They stopped being careful. That was their biggest mistake. Have you ever noticed how confidence makes people careless, especially when they think you're powerless? Because that carelessness became my greatest advantage. After overhearing my son say it would be easier once they officially started handling everything, something inside me changed completely. Until then, I had still been reacting emotionally to what was happening, hurt by the whispers, confused by the sudden supervision, frightened by the way people looked at me now. But after that conversation, I stopped reacting. I started observing. Have you ever realized clarity can feel strangely calming, even when the truth itself is painful? Because that clarity changed how I moved through the house afterward. I became quieter, more patient, less defensive. And because of that, my family relaxed even more around me. Have you ever let people underestimate you because it allowed you to see who they really were? Because that silence became my strongest weapon. I started noticing patterns everywhere now. My son constantly asking questions about paperwork he never cared about before. My daughter suddenly becoming deeply involved in future planning. Family conversations shifting toward legal language, financial management, protecting mom, making things easier long term. Such careful phrases. Such dangerous meanings underneath them. Have you ever realized people often hide control behind responsible sounding words? Because that's exactly what this became. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and found documents spread across the table. They moved too quickly when they saw me. Papers folded away, smiles appearing instantly, casual conversation replacing whatever had actually been happening moments earlier. Have you ever entered a room and immediately known people were hiding something from you? Because that kind of silence reveals everything. I pretended not to notice. That part mattered. Because every time they believed I remained unaware, they exposed more. Have you ever stayed calm simply because you needed the truth more than confrontation? Because that became my strategy completely. Slowly, little details started connecting together. Conversations about account access, discussions about what would happen later, mentions of legal responsibilities. And the more I listened carefully, the more one terrifying possibility became impossible to ignore. They were preparing for control long before anyone officially admitted it. Have you ever realized people can quietly build authority around your life while pretending nothing serious is happening? Because that realization changes how safe your own family feels. But perhaps the most disturbing part was this: they genuinely believed they were justified. That's what made everything feel so dangerous. My family had convinced themselves that because I occasionally forgot things, because I repeated stories sometimes, because I was aging, they had the right to slowly step into control over my future. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase your independence while still seeing themselves as good people? Because good intentions mixed with power become dangerous very quickly. I started testing them quietly after that. Small things at first, mentioning details from conversations I shouldn't remember, asking casual questions about topics they thought I didn't fully understand. And every time I did, I saw the same reaction flash briefly across their faces: surprise. Then discomfort, then quick recovery. Have you ever noticed how people become nervous when you suddenly appear more aware than they expected? Because that nervousness reveals truth faster than honesty. One evening during dinner, my son started explaining something unnecessarily slowly again, speaking to me with that same careful tone people use around someone they no longer fully trust mentally. And suddenly, without planning it, I interrupted him calmly and corrected a financial detail he himself had gotten wrong earlier that week. Silence hit the table immediately. Have you ever watched people struggle when reality no longer matches the story they built about you? Because that silence said more than any argument could. He quickly laughed it off afterward, but I noticed the look exchanged across the table. Concern not about me this time, about themselves. Because for a moment, the narrative they created had cracked slightly. Have you ever realized people become uncomfortable when the person they underestimated starts seeing too clearly? Because that discomfort changed the atmosphere around me completely. But instead of becoming more cautious after that, my family actually became more emotionally invested in proving they were right about me. That's what shocked me most. Every small mistake I made afterward received extra attention. Every forgotten detail became another quiet piece of evidence. It was no longer just concern anymore. It was confirmation bias. They needed me to stay confused because too much now depended on that version of reality. Have you ever realized people sometimes stop looking for truth because they already committed emotionally to a story? Because that realization terrified me. And then one afternoon, I discovered something that changed everything completely. While organizing laundry in the hallway closet, I accidentally found paperwork tucked inside a folder that should never have been there. Legal forms, information about authority, future planning documents involving decisions about my finances and care. My hands shook reading them. Have you ever found proof of something you desperately hoped wasn't real? Because that moment changed everything for me. Suddenly, every whisper, every conversation, every act of fake concern connected together perfectly. This wasn't just family worry anymore. They were preparing for control officially, legally. Quietly, and the most dangerous part, they believed I was too confused to understand what they were doing. But the next thing I discovered hidden inside those papers revealed a plan my family never expected me to uncover. What happens when the people closest to you begin preparing for control before you've even lost your voice? Because there's something terrifying about discovering your life is being quietly reorganized behind your back while everyone still smiles at you during dinner. And that's exactly what I felt standing there in the hallway holding those papers with shaking hands, realizing my family had moved far beyond simple concern. This wasn't just worry anymore. This was preparation, official preparation. Have you ever discovered proof of betrayal so quietly hidden that suddenly every strange moment from the past finally made sense? Because that's exactly what happened to me. I remember staring at the documents for several seconds before my mind fully processed what I was reading: legal terminology, financial authority discussions, long term care planning. Phrases like decision making assistance and future incapacity considerations. Careful language, professional language, dangerous language. Have you ever realized people can hide life changing intentions behind paperwork that sounds completely reasonable on the surface? Because that realization chilled me instantly. At first, I wanted to believe there had to be some misunderstanding, some innocent explanation, but deep down, I already knew better: the whispers, the private conversations. The way everyone suddenly treated me like I was fragile, forgetful, incapable. These papers weren't random. They were the next step. Have you ever realized people don't suddenly decide to take control? They prepare emotionally long before they prepare legally. Because that understanding changed everything for me. I carefully put the documents back exactly where I found them before anyone noticed they'd been touched. That part mattered. Because by now I understood something important. If my family realized I knew the truth, they would become careful. And right now, their confidence was still exposing everything. Have you ever stayed silent simply because silence gave you access to the truth? Because that silence became my strongest weapon. After that day, I stopped seeing my family the same way entirely. Every act of concern suddenly carried hidden meaning. Every gentle question felt calculated. Even simple conversations now sounded like quiet evaluations disguised as love. Have you ever realized how painful it feels when trust disappears inside ordinary moments? Because that loss changes how every room in your house feels afterward. My son especially had changed. He no longer asked whether I needed help with things. He assumed it automatically now. Bills, calls, scheduling, paperwork. Every interaction carried the same hidden message underneath it all: you're no longer fully in charge of your own life. Have you ever noticed how authority becomes dangerous once it starts feeling normal to the people using it? Because normalization is what makes control spread quietly. But instead of panicking after finding those documents, I became calmer, much calmer. That part surprised even me, because once uncertainty disappears, fear often disappears with it. Have you ever noticed how clarity changes your posture completely? Because now I finally understood exactly what was happening around me. My family had convinced themselves I was confused enough to justify slowly stepping into authority over my future. And because they believed that story completely, they stopped hiding their intentions carefully anymore. Have you ever watched people become careless simply because they underestimated you too much, because their certainty became my advantage? I started paying attention to details more carefully than ever now: dates, conversations, financial mentions, legal language casually referenced during phone calls. And slowly the full picture started coming together. They weren't planning immediate control. They were preparing gradual control, the kind that feels reasonable enough nobody questions it until it's already happened. Have you ever realized freedom is rarely taken all at once, but slowly enough that people call it practical? Because that realization terrified me deeply. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, my son sat beside me with unusual calmness and began talking gently about making future arrangements easier while everyone was still thinking clearly. Everyone thinking clearly. Have you ever heard someone quietly question your mental ability while pretending it's a normal conversation? Because that sentence revealed more than he intended. He started mentioning paperwork casually after that. Suggestions about organizing things before confusion creates problems later. And while he spoke calmly, almost lovingly, I suddenly understood something terrifying. He believed I would eventually sign those documents willingly. Have you ever realized people can become so convinced by their own narrative, they stop imagining resistance entirely, because that confidence changes behavior? I nodded quietly through the entire conversation, pretending to think carefully about his suggestions while internally something completely different was happening. I was planning, have you ever known the truth while pretending you didn't, simply because timing mattered more than emotion? Because that became my strategy entirely. They thought I was weak now, confused, easy to guide, easy to pressure emotionally. And because they believed that, they never noticed the one thing that mattered most. I had already started quietly preparing my own move behind their backs. Have you ever realized underestimated people become dangerous the moment they stop reacting emotionally? Because that's exactly what was happening to me now. One night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone replaying every moment from the past few months differently now. The interruptions, the whispered conversations, the paperwork, the concern disguised as control. And suddenly one thought became painfully clear inside my mind. My family no longer feared losing me emotionally. They feared losing control over what they believed was coming next. And while they thought I was too confused to understand any of it, I had already made one call they never expected me to make. Because the moment my family discovered who I secretly contacted behind their backs, everything they believed about me started collapsing instantly. What if the person everyone quietly dismissed as confused turned out to be the only one seeing the situation clearly from the beginning? Because there's something shocking about watching a carefully built story collapse in front of the people who created it. And that's exactly what happened after my family finally learned what I had done behind their backs while they were busy preparing to take control of my life. By then, I wasn't frightened anymore. That part had disappeared completely. What replaced it was something much stronger: certainty. Have you ever noticed how powerful certainty becomes once fear no longer controls you? Because that certainty changed everything for me. The days after I found those papers felt strangely calm on the surface. Family dinners continued, the gentle voices continued, the constant help continued. And the entire time, my family remained completely convinced I still had no idea what they were preparing quietly around me. Have you ever watched people become more careless simply because they believe they already won? Because that confidence became their biggest mistake. Meanwhile, I stayed exactly the same externally. That mattered. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't reveal what I knew. Because emotional confrontation would only warn them before the right moment arrived, and I needed the truth fully exposed first. Have you ever stayed silent not because you were weak, but because timing mattered more than anger? Because that silence became my greatest weapon. The call I secretly made changed everything, quietly, completely. And the strangest part was this: my family never even imagined I was capable of making it. That realization hurt more than I expected. Have you ever realized people stopped expecting intelligence from you entirely? Because that kind of underestimation changes relationships permanently. One evening during dinner, the conversation shifted toward future planning again, just like it always seemed to lately. My son spoke carefully but confidently, mentioning how important it was for everyone to prepare early before confusion gets worse. Worse. That word again. Have you ever noticed how people repeat labels often enough until they start sounding like facts? Because that repetition slowly reshapes reality around you. Then came the moment everything changed. My son calmly brought out paperwork again, placing it carefully on the table with the same soft, patient tone people use when speaking to someone they believe won't fully understand what's happening. He explained how signing a few simple documents would make life easier for everyone moving forward. Easier for everyone, not me, everyone. Have you ever listened to someone disguise control as convenience? Because that's exactly what this was. I looked down at the papers quietly while the room watched me carefully, waiting, expecting hesitation, expecting confusion, expecting dependence. And for the first time in months, I realized just how completely they believed the story they created about me. Have you ever seen people become emotionally attached to a false version of you? Because that realization changes everything. Then calmly, without raising my voice, I asked one simple question: why would I sign papers involving authority changes after what my attorney already explained to me? Silence, complete silence. Have you ever watched certainty disappear from someone's face instantly? Because that's exactly what happened around that table. My son froze. My daughter stared at me in shock. and suddenly the atmosphere inside the room changed completely. Not because I shouted, not because I exposed them dramatically, but because for the first time they realized I understood everything. Have you ever seen people suddenly recognize they underestimated you completely? Because that realization is impossible to hide. I stayed calm after that. Calmness mattered now more than ever. I explained quietly that after discovering the paperwork earlier, I had contacted legal and medical professionals privately myself. Real professionals, independent advice, independent evaluation, independent protection. Everything they believed I was too confused to do alone, I had already done successfully behind their backs. Have you ever realized the people calling you incapable often panic the most when you prove them wrong? Because that panic filled the room completely now. The questions started immediately afterward, too quickly, defensive, emotional. Why would I do that without telling them? Didn't I trust them? Why involve outsiders? But underneath every question sat the same hidden truth. They were no longer discussing my confusion. They were trying to recover control. Have you ever noticed how quickly manipulation collapses once the person being controlled sees everything clearly? Because clarity destroys false narratives fast. I calmly explained something they never expected to hear from me. I said forgetting small things does not make someone incapable. Aging does not erase intelligence. And concern does not give anyone the right to quietly prepare authority over another person's life without honest conversation first. Have you ever realized how powerful your voice becomes once people finally stop dismissing it? Because for the first time in months, nobody interrupted me, nobody corrected me, nobody spoke for me. The room had changed too completely now. My family finally understood something they should have understood from the beginning. I was never confused enough to stop seeing the truth. And the truth was simple. They had slowly stopped respecting my voice long before they officially admitted it. Have you ever realized betrayal hurts most when it hides itself inside good intentions? Because that realization settled heavily over the entire room. But strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious sitting there. I felt free, truly free. Because after months of whispers, assumptions, supervision, and quiet humiliation, the story they built about me had finally collapsed completely. But what my family admitted after the truth came out hurt more than every whisper and hidden conversation combined. What hurts more than being treated like you're confused is discovering the people doing it truly believed they were justified, because betrayal becomes much more painful when it hides itself inside love, concern, and protection. And that painful truth became impossible to ignore after my family realized the woman they underestimated had understood everything all along. The room stayed completely silent after I mentioned speaking with attorneys and professionals privately. Not tense silence at first, shocked silence, the kind that appears when reality suddenly changes too fast for anyone to react properly. Have you ever watched people lose confidence instantly after realizing their assumptions were wrong? Because that's exactly what I saw sitting around that table. My son looked stunned, not angry yet, just confused in a completely different way now. For months, he believed he was slowly helping a mother losing her clarity, and suddenly, the entire story he built about me had cracked open in front of him. Have you ever realized people sometimes believe their own narrative so deeply they stop questioning whether it's actually true? Because that realization changes how you see trust forever. The questions started quickly afterward. Why didn't I tell them what I knew? Why would I secretly contact attorneys? Why would I assume the worst about my own family? But listening to those questions felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. Have you ever noticed how people become hurt by your boundaries when they already expected access to your life? Because expectations change how people interpret your independence. I answered calmly. That part mattered. Because by then, I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was trying to reclaim my dignity. I explained something simple. I contacted professionals because nobody around me was speaking to me honestly anymore. They were speaking about me, around me, over me, but rarely directly to me. Have you ever realized people can slowly take away your voice while convincing themselves they're helping you? Because that realization hurts deeper than anger ever could. My daughters started crying quietly after that, saying they were only scared. Scared I would decline suddenly. Scared something would happen before they prepared properly. And strangely enough, I believed her. That was the complicated part of everything. I truly believe fear existed inside my family, but fear mixed with control becomes dangerous very quickly. Have you ever realized good intentions can still slowly destroy someone's dignity? Because that understanding changed me permanently. Then my son finally admitted something that hurt more than every whisper, every hidden paper, every fake smile combined. He looked at me quietly and said, "We thought you weren't fully understanding things anymore, not sometimes forgetful, not occasionally struggling, fully understanding things anymore." Have you ever heard the people closest to you quietly admit they stopped believing in your mind? Because that kind of pain reaches somewhere words can barely explain. For a moment, I couldn't even answer. Not because I felt weak, but because suddenly I understood the real betrayal underneath everything. This was never only about paperwork or control, it was about identity. My family had slowly replaced the person I truly was with a version easier for them to manage emotionally. A confused older woman, fragile, dependent, easier to guide, easier to control. Have you ever realized people can slowly erase who you are while still believing they love you? Because that realization changes relationships forever. I finally looked directly at my son and told him something I had been carrying inside me for months. I said forgetting small things does not erase a lifetime of intelligence. Aging does not make someone incapable of understanding respect. And most importantly, needing occasional help does not mean surrendering the right to your own voice, choices, and future. Have you ever realized dignity matters just as much as safety? Because that truth became clearer to me than anything else during this entire experience. The room stayed quiet after that, but differently now, honest quiet. Reflective quiet. For the first time in months, nobody was correcting me, nobody was speaking for me. Nobody was exchanging worried glances while I talked. They were finally listening, truly listening. Have you ever noticed how quickly power returns once people finally acknowledge your voice again? Because that recognition changes everything. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. That's important. This was never about humiliating my family or proving I was smarter than them. It was about reclaiming myself before I disappeared completely inside the story they built about me. And thankfully, I realized what was happening before it became permanent. Have you ever realized the most dangerous thing people can take from you isn't money or freedom, it's your credibility? Because once people stop trusting your mind, every part of your life becomes vulnerable afterward. Later that night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone thinking about everything differently now. The whispers, the interruptions, the concern, the paperwork, the humiliation of constantly feeling evaluated inside my own family. And strangely enough, I no longer felt angry. I felt clear, because now I understood something deeply important. People can question your memory, they can underestimate your awareness. They can even convince themselves you no longer understand the truth around you. But real intelligence, the kind built through experience, observation, and self respect, is much harder to erase than people think. And while my family spent months treating me like I was confused, they never realized I was quietly seeing the truth more clearly than anyone else in the room. They treated me like I was confused until the truth exposed who was really refusing to see clearly.